Welcome out tonight, everyone, for session number 5 overall. But we're going to do something a little, not so much different, but I'm going to do this on occasion. I call it a deep dive number 1. As we go through sequentially through the verses of the New Testament, looking at end time passages, occasionally we're going to come across a subject like we did last week. We talked about, or last session, we talked about the kingdom of Satan and the kingdom of God and kind of compared them a little bit. And so this is kind of connected to that in that we're going to do a deeper dive once in a while when we come across a subject that really deserves a closer look or a deeper look. We're going to stop and do that. And so we introduced some things about the Antichrist last session. So we're going to do a deep dive number 1. I'm calling it Antichrist and Christ types, and also various names of the Antichrist. And this will open up a lot about his character as well. So I want to start in Ezekiel 35. And one reason I'm doing this is a lot of people, even Bible teachers, tend to think that, okay, I'm going to teach a lesson on the Antichrist. And so immediately people think, well, there's like 2 or 3 main places. They're all in the New Testament. And so let's go over to 2 Thessalonians 2. Let's go over to Revelation 13. And that's about 90% of anything about the Antichrist. But that's not true at all. Since he is such a primary figure, antagonist against Christ and the plan of Christ, he is shown all the way through the Bible. And he's shown in 2 main ways. He's shown in individuals who are types of the Antichrist. They have the spirit of Antichrist, which is rebellion and arrogance and just all those kind of evil qualities that are opposite of Christ. And then there are many names, descriptive names of the Antichrist scattered all through the Old Testament. And so, for instance, before we look at chapter 35, let's go to the one we have looked at a few times, 38:17. Thus says the Lord God, are you he of whom I have spoken in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel? He's talking about the Antichrist, isn't he? And he's saying that my prophets have talked about you often. So different prophets, different names, different ways of bringing him up, who prophesied for years in those days that I would bring you against them, meaning against Israel. So way back in the beginning, God began building this puzzle, these building blocks, these pieces that when you're able to put them together properly, gives a full picture of this man of sin, the Antichrist, that if you're just reading through the passage, you don't pick up on it. You don't notice it unless you kind of have that mindset of, is this talking about him or is it not? It's kind of like always looking for Christ. But if you're kind of looking for references of the Antichrist, you're going to find a lot more of them than you realize. And I thought it would be good to do this tonight because the internet has exploded with Bible prophecy teachers, many of them asking the question, is Putin the Antichrist? And so all of these lessons from Ezekiel and other places, wondering if Putin is going to bring in the tribulation, is he the Antichrist? The short answer is no, he's not, for a number of reasons. We'll look at a few verses tonight that clearly says when he comes in, he will come in peaceably. In other words, when he starts his time, he's going to bring peace to a time of trouble. So if this is the time of trouble over in Russia and Ukraine, that's going to build over a period of years or whatever to what we call the Great Tribulation, Putin is not the Antichrist because he has not come in peaceably or with flattery, the Bible says about the Antichrist. But then after he gets in and is in charge, then is when he turns to war and destruction. So you got to get the things in the right order. So we read 38:17. Now let's go back to 35:5. And this is about a prophecy about Mount Seir, which is Ishmael and Esau. So again, these ancient antagonists against Christ and his seed. Esau married a daughter of Ishmael, so they became united. So all those peoples over in that part of the world that descended from Ishmael and Esau are the enemies of Isaac and Jacob and their descendants. And it says in verse 5, because you have an ancient hatred. That word ancient could mean everlasting, but old, a long time, an ancient hatred. And there has been an ancient hatred between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And that's Genesis 3:15 that we have looked at a few times. Let's go back there once more as we lay this foundation to start building our blocks that will be a picture of the Antichrist. Genesis 3:15. I like to say this is the pre-incarnate Christ. Normally in the Old Testament, when it's God speaking or in some form, visual form or audible form, when it's God speaking, it's Christ. He is the face. He is the spokesperson of God the Spirit. And so this is Christ speaking directly to Satan. I will put enmity. By the way, that word enmity there is the same word as hatred we just read, because you have an ancient hatred. So it ties the two verses together. This is where it began, and then it continued on in people like Ishmael and Esau. I will put enmity between you and the woman. And I like to say that woman is Eve, but not Eve. It's Sarah, but not Sarah. It's Mary, but not Mary. It's Israel, but not Israel. Church, but not the. In other words, it's a composite woman figure that's bringing forth this godly seed. So it's a lot of women, but it's the woman. So God uses this woman figure throughout history to bring forth this godly seed that results in the seed, Paul says in Galatians 3, which is Christ. And so there will be enmity between Satan and this woman figure, and between your seed and her seed. So between both the people and the individuals representing the people. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Or if you put it in the first person, Christ is telling him, you're not going to know when, and you're not going to know how. But one day I'm going to crush your head. But all along, I am going to allow you to bruise my heel many, many times. So a lot of pain involved of the heel of Christ and his seed. But in the end, it's going to be a crushing of the head. He's the head crusher, this one who comes from the woman. So Satan is a spirit. So when he says, I'm going to crush your head, it's hard to crush the head of a spirit. So this is where the Antichrist figure comes in, is this, just like God the Spirit had a human representation of himself in the person of Christ, Satan the Spirit has a physical representation of himself in the person of Antichrist. So literally, Christ will be able to crush his head because he will be a human being. So it's not, just totally figurative. If I'm going to defeat you, it will be a literal destruction of a man who represents the spirit of Satan. And Paul said to the Romans in Romans 16:20, the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet shortly. So it's going to be a real head crushing. So I asked the question, in what ways is he counterfeit to Christ? Because anti-Christ, anti means against or instead of or false. So in what ways is the Antichrist a counterfeit Christ? And I named three, there might be more. I call him, he's like Christ was the first fruit of the resurrection. That's 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20 through 23. Very familiar verses. But did you know the Antichrist is the first fruit of a group of people also? So, in other words, Jesus rose from the grave, from the dead, a long time before the rest of the saints will rise from the dead. So he was before the time of the resurrection, out of time. And so he is a first fruit of what will come later, the harvest. The same principle is true of the Antichrist. Turn over to Revelation 19. Revelation 19 and verse 20 shows this. Then the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast, those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. Now, he is cast alive into the lake of fire 1,000 years before his seed, his wicked seed. So he's a first fruit. And what I mean by that is the rest of the wicked, those who do not know Christ as Savior, in chapter 20 and verse 13, the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and hell, Hades, delivered up the dead who were in them. They were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. But this happens 1,000 years after the Antichrist. So he is a first fruit figure, just like Christ is. I find that kind of interesting. Second, he's counterfeit in that he also is indwelt by his Father's Spirit. And we'll just stay in Revelation to make it easy to show this. Revelation 13 and verse 2. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear. I've been hearing this verse a lot the last 3 weeks, people saying, well, obviously this is talking about Russia the bear, It's just funny how people just take off on any little thing and try to prove a prophecy. His mouth like the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. It's almost like he's indwelt by Satan. Back in chapter 12 and verse 9, the great dragon was cast out, the serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth. His angels were cast out with him. Then in verse 12, the devil has come down to you having great wrath, knowing he knows he has a short time. So he no longer has access in heaven to accuse the saints. He's cast down and restricted to the earth. But he has a man already on the earth called the Antichrist. And so in some ways, when he's cast down to the earth, he embodies or he indwells his man and is working his will through his man, very much like the Father and the Son during Jesus' ministry. Jesus said over and over, I do nothing unless it's my Father's will. I do nothing unless, the only truth I teach is my Father's truth. But Jesus was God too, but that idea of being indwelt by the Spirit of his Father. And then the Antichrist in 13 and 3 of Revelation has a death and resurrection experience. We don't know exactly what this will be like, but I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded. His deadly wound was healed. All the world marveled and followed the beast. They worshiped him even in verse 4. They said, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? I mean, whatever this is, can you imagine if Jesus' death and resurrection was filmed live on the internet? It would have had a larger impact. It did. Whatever this death and resurrection event is probably going to be live on the internet. Everyone around the world is going to be watching it. And whether it be something, literal, like a team of doctors officially declares him dead, and then, several days later, maybe 3, he's back alive again and on the internet, that kind of thing would cause the whole world to worship him. A true death and resurrection event. Or if it's in some way more symbolic, but it seems to fit the pattern of a counterfeit Christ, to probably be some sort of literal death and resurrection event. So you may have some thoughts on that at the end of the lesson. Some of the major types. Let's talk about some types. I want to go through these quickly because I really want to get to the names. What we find is the Bible often, when you're reading the Bible, if you kind of look at it this way, the Bible deals in usually pairs of people. It'll put a very ungodly Bible character and a very godly Bible character in very close proximity to each other in time. And it's kind of like, to me, it's God's way of showing this over and over and over again. The Christ figure, the Antichrist figure, side by side, all through history. So let's just name some of them real quickly. Cain and Abel. So you know where that story is. I really don't want to take much time on each of these. Cain was angry. He offered a wrong offering. He had a wrong frame of mind, a bad heart. When God confronted him, he argued with him. Who am I? Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know where he's at. And when judgment was pronounced on him, he complained about it. Like, I don't deserve, everyone's going to be after me. Well, you did it to yourself. So all the characteristics of Antichrist are found in Cain. Of course, the characteristics of Christ are found in Abel. Abel offered his sacrifice properly. He offered it with the right heart. It was a blood offering. Everything was good. God accepted it, and he was killed because of it. As we go through these quickly, what we're going to see is almost in every case, the Antichrist figure is the bigger and stronger and seems to overcome the Christ figure. Except David and Goliath, of course. But leading up to it, Las Vegas had odds on Goliath. And I don't think David had very good odds. So, with everyone on both sides, Israel and the Philistines, they were all betting on Goliath. No one was betting on David. The next one is Nimrod and Noah. There are the two put side by side. Of course, Noah in chapters 6 through 8 and 9. Genesis 6:8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So that's the Christ figure. Nimrod is in chapter 10, verses 8 through 11. And he founded 2 great cities, capital cities of 2 later evil empires. He founded Nineveh and he founded Babylon. And it was his spirit that then built the Tower of Babel. And the reason I think, the spirit of Antichrist, the reason he wanted cities is to concentrate power in a smaller location that he could be in control of. It was all about him and his power. So that's the spirit of Antichrist. Noah, the spirit of Christ. Esau and Jacob, of course, I don't need to go into that. Esau despised his birthright. Anything about God, God's birthright, God's blessings, he despised. Jacob, for all his flaws, viewed the birthright and the blessing as something important. And because of that, he was Jacob for a long time, a saved man in the flesh. And finally, God worked on him enough to where he wrestled with him all night, changed his name to Israel, which means Prince of God, which is, I call it the Old Testament name for overcomer in the New Testament. Israel has that same meaning. Pharaoh and Moses, I don't need to go into that. Pharaoh told Moses one time, I will not let your people go because I do not know your God. And it is just a flat out denial of the true God and wanting nothing to do with him. But Moses, by contrast, was called the meekest man on the earth. He forsook it all for Christ. One of the more interesting side-by-sides are two women, Athaliah and Jehosheba. And I do want to read just two verses in 2 Kings 11. This goes on for a few chapters, so we could take too long on this, and I'm not. But in 2 Kings, is that what it says? 2 Kings 11. It's a pretty fascinating story. Athaliah is the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And her son was also king of Judah, Ahaziah. And it says in chapter 11 of verse 1, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal heirs. So you read a verse like that and you think, oh, that's terrible. Who were the royal heirs? Her grandsons. She was the mother of the king, and the royal heirs would be his sons. And so she slaughtered her grandsons because she wanted the power. That's how ruthless she was. It's just brutal stuff. In contrast, the Christ figure is Jehosheba, verse 2, the daughter of King Joram, who was the king of Israel, sister of Ahaziah. This all, how it gets, everyone's related. Took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, stole him away from among the king's sons who were being murdered, and they hid him and his nurse in the bedroom from Athaliah so that he was not killed. I think this is one of the most beautiful and direct pictures because you have Athaliah trying to destroy the royal seed, the godly seed. You have Jehosheba saving the royal seed. And that's as good an Antichrist and Christ description as you'll get in the Bible of two humans. It's just a beautiful story. I'd like to take more time. She was married to Jehoiada, the priest, and he was a godly man. And they worked together to save one son. Talk about it, the whole thing being a Christ picture. All the rest of them were killed. They saved one, and he went on to become king, and he was a good king, and the godly seed was preserved. That's a beautiful one. Haman and Mordecai, of course, we know that story. Haman was a destroyer of the godly seed, and Mordecai was a savior of the godly seed, and also a woman named Esther. She fits in that whole, the seed of the woman, that woman figure that continues the godly seed. We get in the New Testament, there's Judas and John. Have you ever thought about them as being Christ and Antichrist figures? Judas called the son of perdition like the Antichrist is. John, the disciple who Jesus loved. And then there's an interesting one I thought of in the same person, Saul of Tarsus and Paul the Apostle. So Saul of Tarsus definitely was an Antichrist figure trying to destroy the godly seed. Paul spent the rest of his life saving the godly seed. The same man did both. The same man was both Antichrist and Christ. And the grace of God made the difference. So In almost all these cases, the Antichrist figure was bigger and stronger and meaner and looked like they would prevail. And same thing with the final Antichrist. I want to look at let's look at Daniel 7:25 to sum this part up so we can go into his names. Daniel 7:25 says, "He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, shall intend to change times and laws. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time." This is this mysterious principle we've been talking about, where the Antichrist is wicked and evil, and it's in his heart to destroy God's people. But this seems to imply that God was also allowing it. The saints were given into his hand. And the book of Revelation actually says that, so we'll just read that real quick in Revelation 13. This principle of the spirit, a mystery of iniquity, and the mystery of godliness operating side by side. The mystery of iniquity is guilty of all the sins and crimes they commit, but at the same time, God's plan and purpose is moving forward even in the midst of the evil. So it says in Revelation 13:7, it says basically the same thing we just read in Daniel. "And it was granted to him." Who granted it to him? "To make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation." Of course, the idea, he was in the process of overcoming them, just like Jehoshaphat saved Joash down to one son left. He's not going to completely overcome them. Matthew 16:18 is the promise that the gates of hell shall never prevail. But it will look like he is overcoming them to most humans. And we may have read this last time, but 17:17 of Revelation is really the key to all of this. God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So it's God who is actually behind it, allowing the evil to take place. But the evil people still are evil. So it's not like they're just puppets to God's will. He's working in their wickedness to accomplish his will. It's an amazing thing that's a lot more common in the Bible than we realize. Okay, let's talk about some of his names, because this is fascinating to me. Let's go back to Daniel 7 and verse 19 and 20. So Daniel has this vision about this little horn in verse 8. We'll come back to that. But after the end of the vision, in verse 19, Daniel says this: "I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron, its nails of bronze, which devoured broken pieces, trampled the residue with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and about the other horn which came up." I really want to know about that one. "Before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, and which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows." Daniel saying, I really want to know about that little horn. Tell me more. Well, that's what we're trying to do tonight, is we wish to know also. These names, let's just go back to Deuteronomy 32 to pick up the first one. These they're kind of like veiled references. Some of them seem a little vague. You read them at first, you think, oh, you're kind of reading more into it than what's there. But what I'm going to be doing is kind of like what Isaiah 28:10 says. It says, line up on line, precept upon precept, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. And you start building all these things, connecting them together, and they paint a story of this Antichrist figure that Ezekiel in 38:17, God says, are you the one that all my prophets talked about? For a long time, they spoke about it. So we're trying to find where those are. Deuteronomy 32, 42, and 43. At the end of the Song of Moses, he's looking way down at the end of time. I will make my arrows drunk with blood. My sword shall devour flesh. That's right at the return of Christ. With the blood of the slain from the captives. And then this interesting phrase, from the heads of the leaders of the enemy. So there's 10 heads of the enemy when Christ comes back with his sword to devour flesh, blood of the captives. There's 10 heads, Revelation says, but then there's one over all 10. He destroys 3 of them and then takes over the whole group. And a veiled reference to Antichrist. Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants and render vengeance to his adversaries, of which the Antichrist is the final primary adversary. So it's kind of like this, let's introduce this Antichrist figure in this prophecy called the Song of Moses. And you can't really quite grab a hold of it from these, but it's starting to build a foundation that will build on. Psalm 72. Most people don't realize that the Psalms are much more prophetic than they realize. There's a lot of prophecy in Psalms. Psalm 72 and 4, he will bring justice to the poor of the people. He will save the children of the needy. And then this phrase, and will break in pieces the oppressor. We think that's just a general idea of anyone who's an oppressor. But when you put it in context of this whole chapter, this is a messianic psalm written by Solomon. And it's obvious, like in verse 1, give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness to the king's son. That gives us a clue it's about Christ. This one that he's talking about in verse 8 shall have dominion from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. In verse 11, this one he's talking about, all kings shall fall down before him, all nations shall serve him. So you realize this is talking about Christ in his glory, in his second coming, as he comes as king, defeating his enemies, ruling over the earth. So you put all that and go back to verse 4 and put it in context of all that. When he says, I will break in pieces the oppressor, it's a little easier to see. He's talking about the Antichrist there. Isaiah chapter 11. So he's the oppressor, he's the adversary, he's the enemy. And then you read a verse like in Isaiah 11, which obviously is about Christ in both of his comings, as it starts out in the chapter. But verse 4, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked one. I think the word one should be in there. The evil one. And the reason I say this is definitely speaking about the Antichrist is the wording of this may seem familiar to you. Keep your finger here and go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 8, where Paul quotes Isaiah 11:4 and applies it directly to the Antichrist. That's how we know Isaiah 11:4 is talking about him. 2 Thessalonians 2:8, then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will, here it is, consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. A lot of you may have a reference note that Paul is quoting Isaiah 11:4. It's worded a little different naturally, but that's the verse he had in mind, applying it to the Antichrist. in chapter 16 of Isaiah, there's several in Isaiah, 16 and 4, he's called the spoiler and the extortioner, at least in the New King James. 16:4, let my outcast dwell with you, O Moab, be a shelter to them from the face of the spoiler. My footnote says this word spoiler can mean devastator. And then he's called the extortioner, is at an end. Devastation ceases, the oppressors are consumed out of the land. So you notice in verse 5, it's in, again, a lot of these you first read them and think, is it the Antichrist or not? But you start looking at the context, in almost every case, it's in context of the second coming of Christ. For instance, verse 5, in mercy the throne will be established, and one will sit on it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking justice and hastening righteousness. So when the face of the spoiler and the extortioner is at an end, is the same time this one from David will sit on the throne. So we can add two more names, the spoiler and the extortioner, to all of these. And if we go back to chapter 10 and verse 24, here's one that's easy to miss. 10 and 24, therefore thus says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrian. You say, well, okay, Assyria was the power at that time. He's really talking about, maybe the king of Assyria or the Assyrian people or something. But again, in context of like verse 20 through 23, he talks about in that day, which almost always is talking about the day of the Lord, the remnant of Israel, such as escaped the house of Jacob, will never again, okay, that's the millennial, will never again depend on him who defeated them, but will depend on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. The remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. They haven't done that yet. For though your people, O Israel, be as the sand of the sea, yet a remnant of them will return. The destruction decreed shall overflow with righteousness. That's the millennial. For the Lord God of hosts will make a determined end in the midst of all the land. So in context of that, he's saying, when the Assyrian. So this spirit of Antichrist is the spirit of the Assyrian Empire. It's the same spirit. Remember in Revelation 13, he comes as a leopard, he comes as a bear, he comes as a lion. That's all those animals and more in Daniel 7, all those world empires. But in Revelation 13, it applies all those animals to the Antichrist. So he brings that spirit of all those world empires when he takes over. So don't be afraid of him when he comes, because my plan for you is verse 20 through 23. I'm going to rescue you. You're going to be in good shape. There's going to be righteousness and peace. But when the Assyrian comes, he's going to strike you with a rod, lift up his staff against you in the manner of Egypt. And it's going to be yet for a little while, in verse 25. And the indignation will cease, as will my anger in their destruction. So all that's going to happen is just going to last for a little while, then I'm going to come and rescue you.
What book are you reading now?
Isaiah 10, verse 24.
Thank you.
Here's a graphic one here, 27 and 1, Isaiah 27 and 1. I like this one a lot. In that day, the Lord with his severe sword, there's that sword again, great and strong, so that's Revelation 19, when he comes back with that sword goes out of his mouth, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. I like that idea, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, that twisted serpent. Interesting way of calling him. The Old King James calls him the crooked serpent. So it's that serpent back in the garden. It's that serpent that fills the Antichrist. He will slay the reptile, the Old King James calls it the dragon, that is in the sea. Now, where do you know about a dragon that's comes up out of the sea. Revelation 13:1. That beast rises up out of the sea. And he's a twisted serpent. And the Lord's going to destroy him with a severe sword. So I like that one quite a bit. In 29:20 of Isaiah, he's called the terrible one, or the terrifying one. For the terrible one is brought to nothing, the scornful one is consumed, all who watch for iniquity are cut off. Again, in context, there's a lot of language in this chapter about the second coming of Christ. Let's go to Jeremiah. I know this is kind of a sword drill tonight, and kind of some of these seem clearer than others, but we're trying to put them all together because we're trying to understand when God said, "Are you the one that all my prophets spoke about?" Well, we're trying to find some of those places, and we're probably missing quite a few. Jeremiah 30 and verse 14. All your lovers have forgotten you. They do not seek you, for I have wounded you with the wound of an enemy, with the chastisement of a cruel one. He's called a cruel one here. Now, again, this is in context of like verse 7, the time of Jacob's trouble, which is the great tribulation. In verse 9, they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king. This is long after David had died. This is talking about Christ from the line of David, whom I will raise up for them. So again, if you put these in context and see that it's the return of Christ and his setting up of his kingdom, then it starts talking about a cruel one and an enemy, and I'm going to destroy him. You need to see it as the Antichrist. Let's go to Daniel and pick up a few. And I'm not even going to read the ones in the New Testament, at least not tonight, just maybe refer to them because we're familiar with those. But like in Daniel 7 and 8, I mentioned, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one. So we call him the little horn, coming up among them. So that's another reason I can't make it Putin or some powerful world leader right now, because you read through Daniel 7 and 11 especially, it really describes him as he comes up with a few people. He comes up with a little group of people. He's a little horn. He's really kind of unnoticed at first. He's not some big, powerful leader right from the start. He becomes that, but he doesn't start that way. And so you really need to think about that when you're looking at world leaders. A little one coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out of the roots. There were in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous or great or arrogant words. Verse 11, I watched them because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. That's exactly what we read in Revelation 19 and 20. So much of what is in the New Testament about these subjects, their foundation is in the book of Daniel. Verse 23, thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms. He shall devour the whole earth, trample it, break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. So again, this idea of he's not prominent at first. These 10 kings rise up first, and then they find their leader. So it's interesting. Sometimes we get it in backwards order. He's kind of behind the scenes, kind of unnoticed, not real well known, doesn't have a lot of power, doesn't seem to have a big army at first. He acquires that later and then uses it for destruction. But at first he has to use deception, flattery, other means at first to gain his power.
Rick, can you read verse 12?
Oh, sure. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time.
What's that talking about?
Well, I think what it's trying to express is that, the beast of Daniel 11, the beast of Babylon, the beast of the Persians, the beast of Greece, and then the beast of Rome, or whatever the fourth beast is, Ottoman Empire. They're kind of described as like they live and then they die and then the next beast takes over. But in Revelation 13, it describes the final Antichrist as like all of those beasts at once. So I think what this is saying is that each empire is taken over by another beast, but the qualities of the previous beast continues on in that new empire. I think that's what it's trying to say. So they are destroyed. Babylon was destroyed by the Persians, but the Persians set up Babylon as one of their capital cities. So it's like Babylon continued in Persia, but Babylon was destroyed. Alexander did the same thing with Babylon and the big cities of Persia. He kept them as like capital cities. So the previous empire continued to a degree, even though they were destroyed. I think that's the idea of, in a sense, they're prolonged, even though they're gone. At least that's how I take it. 11:21 of Daniel. And this one he's called a vile person. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably, there it is, and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Well, Putin didn't do that. So he's the opposite of how this man is going to come in. And so that's part of the deception, is that people are looking for some big, famous, well-known, powerful figure, but he's not that in the beginning. So that's part of the whole deception of it. Down in verse 24, he shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province. He shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. So this is one of the ways he gains power, is that he gets enough plunder and riches. Could be oil, could be, we're all being told we have to convert over to electric vehicles. That requires certain minerals and rare items that are in countries that we don't control. Who knows? He may figure out some way to corner the market on some rare minerals or on the oil or something we don't even know about now that the world cannot operate without. And then he'll start, okay, I'll give you, $100 billion of this spoil if you
Are you reading the eyelash thing?
yeah, I know I'm going pretty fast on these. Verse 24, Daniel 11,
24, Daniel 2014?
Daniel 11.
11:24.
11:24.
Yeah, 11:24. Sorry about that. I prepared too much material tonight. He shall enter peaceably even into the richest places of the province. He shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. He shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. And this may be talking about the 7-year treaty he plans, because his plan is not for 7 years. He may be able to talk all the parties into saying, let's try this for 7 years and see how it works. But he's just buying time, because his plan all along is to break that treaty after 3.5 years and turn against Israel. So that's part of his deception as well. His end is found in 11:45. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. By the end of the story, He's kind of all alone. I'll read one more. Well, I'll give you two more. Micah 5, verses 5 and 6. Again, this is in context of Christ. This is the famous passage that a lot of preachers preach on Christmas, the prophecy about Bethlehem. But out of that, he'll become a ruler, and he's going to be great in verse 4 to the ends of the earth. Verse 5, this one shall be peace. And then when the Assyrian, so this is in context clearly of the return of Christ. He's going to set up peace. He's going to be strong. He's going to be a ruler. But now this Assyrian again, just like we read back in Isaiah 10 and 24. So in Isaiah, you read it, don't be afraid of the Assyrian. Is that really the Antichrist? Well, Micah picks up on the same theme, context of the return of Christ, and calls this one who is opposed to Christ. The Assyrian comes into our land when he treads in our palaces. Then we shall raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princely men. They shall waste with the sword the land of Assyria, the land of Nimrod at its entrances. Thus he, meaning this ruler from Bethlehem, shall deliver us from the Assyrian. This is long after the Assyrian Empire. I mean, so it's not talking about the empire. It's talking about some future person when he comes into our land, when he treads within our borders. The last one I'll read is Habakkuk, if you can find Habakkuk. Maybe it's not in your Bible. It's right before Zephaniah, if that helps. Habakkuk or Habakkuk, however you want to pronounce it. Chapter 3 and verse 13. Habakkuk 3 and 13. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from foundation to neck. Okay, it's kind of convoluted language a little bit, but it's talking about someone is going to bring salvation, and this one that brings salvation is an anointed one, and this anointed one is going to strike the head of the house of the wicked. So that's kind of like just a different way of saying Genesis 3:15. This word struck, the ESV version translates it as crush. So again, that's really like Genesis 3:15. You're going to crush the head of the house of the wicked who brings salvation. So when God says to this one named Gog in Ezekiel 38, Gog of Magog, he refers to him as a person. So Gog is a name of Antichrist. And he says, are you the one that all my prophets spoke about? And he is. And some of these may have been a little bit veiled, they may have been a little bit vague and so forth, but they're all speaking about the same person that Ezekiel 38:17. So all of these, and the whole reason for going through this exercise is so that when you're reading 2 Thessalonians 2 and 3, where it calls him the man of sin, the son of perdition, you can think to yourself, there's a whole string of Old Testament verses that talks about him. It's leading up to this that Paul grabs hold of. In 2 Thessalonians 2 and 8, he's called the wicked one or the lawless one. And then in Revelation 13 and 17 and 19, all through Revelation, he's called the beast. It's like God sticks to that one name in Revelation because in context of the Bible, especially like Daniel 7, all of these evil Gentile empires who tried to destroy Israel. And then later in the New Testament, they start trying to destroy the church saints, the people of God. All of these who represent those who tried to destroy the royal seed, the seed of the woman, are all beasts. They're beastly kingdoms. They have the characteristics of wild beasts. And so it's kind of like God is saying in Revelation, I'm going to keep calling him the beast because when you read about him, I want you to think about what I revealed to Daniel in Daniel 7 and Daniel 2. In Daniel 2, it's the image. In Daniel 7, it's the different beast, but it's the same lesson. So what is the spirit of Antichrist? 2 Thessalonians 2 and 4 says that he opposes God and exalts himself above all that is called God. So the two main characteristics of Antichrist, he's an opposer of God, and he exalts himself above all that is called God. The most arrogant man to have ever lived. But he's going to be so smart and arrogant that he's going to figure out a way to come up almost unnoticed at first. What is the Spirit of Christ? Matthew 11:29, come unto me, all ye who labor, heavy laden, I will give you rest. I am meek and lowly in heart. The Spirit of Christ is the spirit of a servant. Behold my servant, Isaiah says. He came as a servant to do his Father's will. Antichrist will be a servant to his Father, but I don't know that it's a willing pairing as much as like God the Father and God the Son. It's almost like Satan is cast down to earth and he has one place to go in that man of sin. But it seems like kind of an uneasy union as compared to Christ and his Father. So that's a deep dive lesson on the Antichrist. It covered a lot of verses, just a lot of different things that we dealt with, but I hope that at least it gives you just a better feel. There's a lot more in the Bible about this man than I thought. He's like all the way through, so that those people reading through those Old Testament prophets, something should start clicking. There's somebody being talked about here over and over with different word, different terminology. He's one bad man. We need to be on the lookout for him because he's going to try to destroy us when he comes along. And yet we have a Messiah who will rescue us at some point. So we'll close it off on that and pick up back in Matthew next time, start as we go through the verses. There's a number of verses leading up to Matthew 24, but we're racing to get to Matthew 24 because that's the real juicy parts are.